Close your eyes for a moment and go back in time. Picture a 2-year-old child. No grammar, no dictionary, no verb charts, yet somehow they learn an entire language without ever studying. How is that possible? The secret isn't in the words, it's in how the brain is used, and that's exactly what polyglots have mastered. They don't study a language, they recreate the experience of being a child learning again. It sounds simple, but it's revolutionary. Their minds aren't trapped by rules, they're focused on absorbing living patterns, real, emotional, human context. Before we go deeper, hit the like button, and now listen carefully. The brain doesn't learn what it's forced to. It learns what it feels. Every new word must be connected to an emotion, an image, a moment. That's how a language stops being a chain of sounds and becomes an extension of who you are. The mistake most people make is trying to learn like logical adults, when the secret is to relearn like curious children. Polyglots don't worry about being right. They focus on sounding natural. They don't memorize isolated words. They surround themselves with living context. They listen to real conversations, watch scenes, observe gestures, and let the brain connect everything on its own. They don't translate everything because translation slows the mind. It builds a bridge where there should be fusion. They embrace the discomfort of not understanding it all because that discomfort is the brain building new connections. And most importantly, they don't wait for the perfect moment to start speaking. They speak incorrectly on purpose, because mistakes are the gym of the mind. Every time you say something wrong and correct yourself, your brain locks in the right form 10 times stronger. It's like carving a diamond. Not one perfect strike, but the sum of thousands that shapes brilliance. The mind of a polyglot doesn't seek perfection, it seeks rhythm. And rhythm is born when learning becomes part of your life, not just part of your study routine.
Now, I want you to write in the comments, "My mind is ready to learn."
When you write that, you send a direct message to your subconscious, declaring that you're ready to change. Now imagine your mind as fertile soil. Everything you plant in it grows. The problem is, most people plant the wrong seeds. When you say, "I'm bad at languages," the brain doesn't argue, it obeys. When you repeat, "This is hard," it builds resistance. But when you say, "I learn," something shifts. The brain begins to reorganize itself. Polyglots understand this intuitively. They train the mind like a muscle through small daily repetitions with consistency, not desperate effort. They create a mental micro-world in the new language. They change their phone settings, think in simple phrases, narrate what they're doing. Je bois de l'eau. Estoy abriendo la puerta. It sounds trivial, but it's profoundly powerful. Because every time you name the world, the language stops being foreign and starts becoming yours. They repeat small stories and patterns until the brain automates, just like hearing a song so many times that suddenly you can sing it without thinking. They use what's called massive comprehensible input, consuming material just slightly above their level, listening and watching until the language feels familiar. School taught you to fear mistakes, but the brilliant mind uses them as a map. This isn't about memorizing phrases. It's about creating sensations. When learning becomes sensory, language stops being studied and starts being lived. And here lies the difference that changes everything. Schools teach you to understand a language, but polyglots learn to think inside it.
When you think inside a language, it's no longer translation. It's pure thought.
At that point, you're not speaking French, Spanish, or any other language. You are French. You are Spanish as you speak. That's what awakens the brain, the feeling of, "I'm inside this." That's why some people learn in months what others take years to grasp. Listen to me carefully now, because this is where learning stops being effort and becomes intelligence. There's a principle few people know, and it completely changes how the brain locks a language in place. You only truly understand something when you can explain it simply. I call this the reverse teaching method. Polyglots do this instinctively. They learn a new structure, for example, j'ai attendu, and instead of just repeating it, they try to teach themselves what it really means. They think, this is like saying, I've been waiting for a while. But look how this language builds time differently. Interesting.
In that instant, the brain stops repeating and starts reorganizing the logic of the language. That's where learning becomes irreversible. When you explain something, even if it's to your reflection, you're forcing your brain to build new connections, to translate chaos into clarity. The result? You stop memorizing and begin understanding from the inside out. That's the difference between speaking a language and thinking in one. If you want to apply this in practice, start small. With every new word or phrase, create a tiny explanation. Speak out loud, even if it feels strange. Imagine you're teaching someone invisible in front of you. Record yourself for 1 minute a day, teaching a new structure. At first it may feel silly, but it's powerful. Your brain starts storing the language not as sound, but as concept. And that's how fluency is born. Because true fluency isn't speed in speaking, it's clarity in thinking.
The more you teach yourself, the more your brain believes that knowledge is essential for survival and keeps it. This is pure neuroscience in action, but with the simplicity of a child. It's a return to the original curiosity, the same kind of thinking children use to discover the world. Now imagine something even deeper. You don't learn a language, you become someone who speaks that language. That's what I call the identity shift technique. The fastest polyglots in the world don't try to learn Spanish or learn French. They become Spanish or French on the inside. It's an identity shift, not just a vocabulary expansion. When you adopt the mental role of someone who already speaks the language, the brain stops translating and starts behaving as if it were already fluent. This happens because you activate the same neural system used when imitating behavior. The brain doesn't distinguish learning from acting. It believes in the role you play. That's why the secret is to live as if. Choose 1 hour a day to inhabit this new version of yourself. During that hour, think, narrate, react, dream, and speak, only in the new language. If it's French, talk to yourself like someone calm, expressive, and curious. Je suis là. Je comprends. Je peux le faire. If it's Spanish, use the energy, the rhythm, the warmth of the language. Estoy aprendiendo. Estoy viviendo este idioma. Create a small character of yourself who lives in that language. At first it feels like play, but that's exactly how the brain learns. It must believe before it can master. The more time you spend being this version of yourself, the more natural the language becomes. Fluency comes long before perfection, because the brain begins to recognize the language as part of your identity.
Listen to me carefully now, because this is the moment where everything connects, the point where learning stops being technique and becomes transformation. When you combine the identity method with reverse teaching, language stops being something you force and becomes something that shapes you. Every new phrase you understand is an expansion of consciousness. Now imagine that you wake up tomorrow and truly decide to learn a new language. No empty promises, no lists of words you'll forget in 2 days. I want you to understand how the brain actually creates fluency. The first step is meaningful exposure. Choose a real theme from your life, something that awakens curiosity in you. It could be cooking, philosophy, travel, anything. Then find a short 1-minute audio or video in that language. Listen without trying to translate. Let your brain get used to the sounds, the rhythm, the unknown. The secret is to listen to the same content over and over until the strangeness disappears. The second step, repeat out loud. Even if you get it wrong, sound repetition creates new connections in the brain. If possible, record your voice. This isn't vanity, it's neurotraining. The brain needs to hear itself to recognize the language as its own. The third step is what I call the pattern of the day. Choose one simple structure and use it in real situations. For example, je suis à la maison, estoy en casa. Then transform it. Je suis prêt, estoy cansado, je suis heureux. Repeat these variations like you're playing the same musical note until it sounds natural. The fourth step is to narrate your own life. Talk to yourself constantly. Je vais dormir, voy a trabajar, je prends un café. Don't wait for the perfect moment. The language must live inside every gesture until it becomes natural. The fifth step is to teach what you've learned. Speak out loud and explain it to yourself as if you were giving a lesson. This practice forces the brain to reorganize what it knows. That's where fluency begins.
when the mind stops repeating and starts understanding.
Finally, the sixth step. Create a sacred daily time where you live the language. No other languages, just that one. Become this new you for 30 minutes a day. Speak, think, write, and act like someone who already masters it. The brain believes what you repeat with emotion, and when it believes, it changes. This isn't motivation, it's biology. Now listen closely, because this is where learning becomes permanent. A language only becomes part of you when it stops being an exercise and becomes a state of mind. Starting tomorrow, begin your day without touching your phone. In those first few minutes of the morning, think in the new language. Take a deep breath and say, quietly but firmly, a short and true phrase. Je suis le maître de mon esprit, or Yo controlo mi mente. Say it with conviction. The brain responds to intention before repetition. Then visualize what you'll learn that day. See yourself speaking naturally. Imagine the words flowing effortlessly. That mental picture is the map your brain will try to follow. During the day, protect that map. Set fixed moments of practice and treat them as sacred appointments with your future. Turn off distractions, shut the world out, and dive into the language. Repeat, make mistakes, laughing, but don't stop. Every time you move through discomfort, the brain recognizes that knowledge as important and strengthens it. At night, before sleeping, spend 5 quiet minutes reviewing what you've learned. Don't read or write, just think in the language. Let the sentences echo in your mind like background music. Your brain will keep learning while you sleep, reorganizing and reinforcing what you practiced. This is true discipline, repeating with presence, not obligation. And remember, the language itself is not the final goal. It's the path that leads you to expansion, clarity, and confidence. When you master a new language, you're not just learning to speak to others, you're learning to speak with new versions of yourself. To speak another language is ultimately to discover how many worlds already live inside you. Learning a language is in truth a training of perception. The brain begins to see the world from another angle, and that changes everything, even the way you think about your own life. When you start to think inside another language, you discover that certain emotions exist only within specific words. French teaches you the art of subtlety. Spanish reveals a kind of intensity that English sometimes hides. You're not just memorizing sounds, you're becoming more human. And that's why people who master languages are never the same afterward. They develop empathy, creativity, and mental flexibility. Because every language is a window into a different way of feeling. And the more windows you open, the freer you become. Polyglots aren't just people who speak many languages. They're people who feel in many frequencies. That's true genius. Not memorizing, but expanding perception. When you embrace discomfort, when you speak even without certainty, when you persist even without perfection, the brain understands what's happening. It realizes you're serious. And when the brain recognizes commitment, it changes levels. It begins to prioritize that learning, to process it while you sleep, to build bridges between memories. That's why one day suddenly you wake up and realize you're thinking in another language, effortlessly, without translation, without even noticing. That's the moment when a language stops being something you learn and becomes something you are. Leave a like if this message resonated with you, and make sure to subscribe to the channel right now. Here you'll learn to train your mind in a way schools never taught you. Simple, powerful, and transformative. And write in the comments, "My mind is ready to learn." That simple phrase is more than a comment. It's a reprogramming. Keep learning, even when no one is watching. True transformation doesn't happen in front of cameras. It happens in the silence of those who practice every day. And before you know it, you'll realize you didn't just learn a new language. You learned how to speak with the infinite inside you. Thank you for watching until the end. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video. There's a pattern hiding in plain sight that most people miss completely when they're trying to learn something new. It's not about working harder or spending more hours with your nose buried in a book. It's about understanding how the mind actually builds knowledge versus how we've been taught to think it works. The difference is extraordinary. One approach leaves you frustrated, forgetting everything within days. Makes ideas stick permanently, almost effortlessly. And the strange part, most people spend their entire lives using the first method. Why learning feels like such a struggle? Here's what typically happens when someone decides to learn something. They open a textbook, start reading from page 1, try to absorb everything in order. They highlight passages, they take notes, they reread the same material multiple times. Then, test day arrives, or when they actually need to use what they learned, they discover that most of it has evaporated from their mind like water on hot pavement. Sound familiar? This isn't a personal failing. This is what happens when you approach learning the way most educational systems have conditioned us to approach it. We've been trained to treat knowledge like filling a container, pouring information in until it's full. But the mind doesn't work that way. It never has. The mind builds connections. It creates networks. It links new information to existing understanding through active reconstruction, not passive absorption. When you simply read and reread, asking your brain to memorize without giving it the structure it needs to actually understand. And without understanding, there's nothing for the memory to anchor to. The last time you really learned something that stayed with you permanently, not memorized for a test and forgotten, truly learned. Chances are, you didn't learn it by reading the same explanation over and over. You learned it by wrestling with it, by trying to use it before you fully understood it, making mistakes and correcting them, by explaining it to someone else, even if that someone was just yourself talking out loud. This is the pattern. The mind learns by doing the work of reconstruction, not by passively receiving information. Every time you force yourself to recall something without looking at the source, every time you try to explain a concept in your own words, every time you attempt to solve a problem before checking the answer, engaging the exact mechanism that makes learning permanent. But we resist this. We resist it because it feels harder. It feels less efficient. When you're reading a textbook, you're making progress. The pages turn. The material looks familiar. You get that comfortable sensation of recognition. But recognition isn't understanding. Recognition is just your mind saying, "Yes, I've seen these symbols before." That's not the same as being able to reconstruct the idea from scratch. Here's the fundamental principle that changes everything. Your mind doesn't store information like a filing cabinet stores folders. It stores the ability to regenerate ideas. Think about how you remember a song. You don't store every note in some mental database. You store the pattern, and your mind regenerates the melody when you need it. Learning works the same way. When you try to recall something, when you struggle to regenerate an idea without looking at your notes, brain strengthens the pathways that allow you to reconstruct that knowledge. The struggle isn't a sign that the method isn't working. The struggle is the method working. Feeling of difficulty, that mental strain when you're trying to remember or work something out, that's your brain building the exact pathways you need. Now, most people make a critical mistake. They feel that difficulty and think they're not ready. They think they need to study more before testing themselves. So they go back to rereading, reviewing, going over the material again and again until it feels comfortable. But by doing this, avoiding the very process that creates real learning. The brain needs resistance to build strength, just like muscles need resistance to grow. You're reading material for the third time, and it all seems obvious. You're not learning. You're experiencing the illusion of competence. The material seems clear because you're looking right at it. But close the book and watch how quickly that clarity evaporates. What you want to do instead is close the book much earlier than feels comfortable. Before you think you're ready, try to write out the main ideas from memory. Not word for word, in your own understanding. If you can't do it, that's not failure. That's information. That's your mind showing you exactly where the gaps are. And those gaps are valuable. They tell you what to focus on. Then, after you've struggled with it, after you've tried and perhaps failed to reconstruct the idea, that's when you go back to the material. your mind is ready to learn. Now you have specific questions. Now you're not just passively reading, you're actively filling in gaps that you've already identified. The difference in retention is dramatic. This applies to everything: mathematics, physics, language, history, anything. The method is always the same: engage with the material actively, not passively. Force yourself to generate answers rather than recognize them. Build the knowledge rather than try to store it. Let's take mathematics as an example. Most people approach learning mathematics by reading through example problems, following along with the solution, nodding when it makes sense, and then moving on to the next problem. Even copy the solution into their notes. Then when they sit down to do problems on their own, they're stuck. They can't replicate what seemed so clear when they were looking at the example. Why? Because watching someone else solve a problem and solving it yourself are completely different mental activities. When you're watching, you're following a path someone else has cleared. When you're solving, you're clearing the path yourself, and it's only in clearing that path that you actually learn where the obstacles are and how to navigate around them. The effective approach is this: look at a problem, close the book, try to solve it. Even if you have no idea where to start, try anyway. Write something down. Make an attempt. The attempt itself, even if wrong, prepares your mind to understand the solution in a way that passive reading never could. When you then look at the solution, just following steps, you're seeing what you missed, understanding why your approach didn't work, building genuine understanding. The same applies to reading difficult material. Don't just read a chapter from start to finish, taking notes along the way. Instead, read a section, close the book, and try to explain the main idea to yourself, out loud if possible. Use your own words. Draw your own diagrams. If you can't do it, if the explanation falls apart or doesn't make sense, that tells you exactly what you need to reread. You're not rereading everything. You're strategically going back to the specific parts that you couldn't reconstruct. This makes studying more efficient, not less. You spend less time overall because you're focusing your effort exactly where it needs to go, then spreading it equally across material you already understand and material you don't. Now, there's a deeper reason why this pattern works. It has to do with how knowledge exists in the mind. Understanding isn't a thing you possess. It's a process you can perform. When you truly understand something, what you have is the ability to reconstruct the reasoning, to regenerate the concept from fundamental principles. You don't need to remember every detail because you can derive the details from the underlying structure. This is why someone who genuinely understands a subject can explain it in multiple ways, can answer questions they've never heard before, can adapt their knowledge to new situations. Retrieving memorized answers. They're generating answers based on their understanding of how things work. And how do you develop that ability to generate rather than retrieve? Practicing generation. By forcing yourself to work things out rather than looking up answers. By explaining concepts in your own words rather than repeating the textbook's words. By solving problems rather than reading solutions. The mind is remarkably good at finding shortcuts. If you give it the option to recognize an answer rather than generate one, take that option every time. Recognition is easier, faster, requires less energy. But recognition doesn't build understanding. Generation builds understanding. This looks like in practice. Suppose you're trying to learn the physics of how objects fall. The standard approach would be to read about gravity, read the equations, study example problems, maybe do a few practice problems that are very similar to the examples. You'd feel like you understand because the equations look familiar and the examples make sense. But now try this before reading anything. Try to figure out on your own what determines how fast something falls. Just think about it. Come up with hypotheses. Does the weight matter? Does the height matter? Write down your ideas. They'll probably be wrong. That's fine. That's perfect, actually. Now, when you read the actual explanation, you're not just passively receiving information. You're comparing your ideas against what's really happening. You're seeing where your intuition was right and where it was wrong. You're building understanding by seeing the contrast between your initial model and the correct model.
This creates learning that sticks because you're not just memorizing facts, understanding why those facts are what they are and not something else. This works for everything. Before reading a historical account, ask yourself what you think happened and why. Before learning a formula, try to derive it yourself from principles you already know. Before accepting an explanation, try to come up with alternative explanations and see if you can figure out why they don't work. You're not trying to reinvent everything from scratch. You're preparing your mind to understand by engaging it actively. You're creating questions that the material will answer. A mind with questions learns differently than a mind that's just trying to absorb whatever it's given. The beautiful thing about this approach is that it makes learning interesting. Actively working things out when you're testing your understanding, when you're catching your own mistakes, you're engaged. You're not bored. The mind likes problems. It likes puzzles. Give it the work of figuring things out and it performs magnificently. Ask it to sit still and absorb information passively, and it rebels. This is also why explaining concepts to others is so powerful for learning. When you explain something, you can't rely on recognition to generate the explanation from your understanding, and in doing so, you immediately discover what you actually understand versus what you only thought you understood. The gaps become obvious. The places where your explanation gets fuzzy or circular, those are exactly the places where your understanding is incomplete. You don't need another person for this to work. Explain concepts to yourself. Pretend you're teaching an invisible student. Write out explanations as if you're writing a textbook. The act of putting understanding into words, into your own words, forces a kind of mental clarity that passive reading never demands. And here's something crucial: afraid of making mistakes during this process. Mistakes aren't obstacles to learning. They're part of the mechanism of learning. When you try to solve a problem and get it wrong, when you try to explain something and realize your explanation doesn't make sense, that's not wasted time. That's your brain identifying exactly where to focus its effort. The education system has trained us to fear mistakes, to see them as failures. But in actual learning, mistakes are incredibly valuable. They show you the difference between what you thought you knew and what you actually know. They create the mental friction that leads to real understanding. So make mistakes deliberately before you know how to solve them. Attempt explanations before you've mastered the material. Test yourself before you feel ready. Every mistake is information. Every gap you discover is an opportunity to build genuine understanding rather than the illusion of knowledge. Think about how children learn to speak. Study grammar rules and vocabulary lists. They try to communicate, make mistakes, get corrected, try again. They're constantly generating language, testing what works, adjusting based on feedback. It's messy and full of errors, but it works. They develop the ability to generate language rather than just recognize it. Apply that same principle to any kind of learning. Generate first. Test yourself first. Try to work things out before looking up the answer. It feels harder because it is harder in the right way. Hard in the way that builds capability rather than just creating the temporary sensation of familiarity. The pattern is simple. Engage actively with what you're learning. Force yourself to reconstruct rather than recognize. Build understanding through the work of generation, passive absorption of information. Test yourself before you feel ready. Make mistakes and learn from them. Explain concepts in your own words. Struggle with problems before looking at solutions. This isn't a trick or a hack. This is just aligning your study methods with how the mind actually learns. The mind learns by building the capacity to regenerate knowledge, not by trying to store it like data in a file. Give your mind the work of regeneration, and it will build genuine, permanent understanding. Everything you truly know, you know, because at some point you did the work of figuring it out, of working through it, of making it your own. That's the only way knowledge becomes real, not by reading about it, not by recognizing it, by generating it yourself from your own understanding in your own mind. That's the pattern. Use it and watch what happens to everything you try to learn.
You know, people often ask me how I manage to understand so many different things: physics, mathematics, biology. even safe cracking and bongo drums. They assume there must be some kind of trick to it, some natural talent I was born with. But that's not really true. The truth is much simpler, and perhaps more useful. I learned how to learn. And once you know how to learn, everything becomes possible. Let me tell you about something that happened when I was working at Los Alamos during the war. We had all these brilliant people, some of the greatest minds in physics, and we were all working on this enormous problem. One day, I was sitting in the cafeteria with some colleagues, and they were discussing a particular aspect of neutron diffusion. The conversation was full of complex equations and technical terms, and I noticed that while everyone was nodding along, I had this uncomfortable feeling that I didn't really understand what we were talking about. Not deeply, anyway. Now, I could have just stayed quiet and pretended to understand. That's what most people do. But I had learned something important years before, something my father taught me when I was just a boy. He taught me that knowing the name of something is not the same as knowing something, and that distinction changed everything for me. My father used to take me on walks in the Catskill Mountains. He wasn't a scientist, he was in the uniform business, but he had this wonderful way of looking at the world. We'd see a bird, and he'd say, "You see that bird? In German, it's called a Fehlstorch. In Chinese, they call it a Chungling. In Japanese, a Katakataka. You can know all those names in every language in the world, but when you're done, you'll know absolutely nothing about the bird. You'll only know about people in different places and what they call a bird." Now, he'd say, "That bird is a brown-throated thrush, and it's singing because it's defending its territory or attracting a mate. When it moves like that, it's looking for insects. That's beginning to know something." This lesson stuck with me, really stuck, because I realized that most of what we call knowledge is actually just familiarity with labels. We mistake the map for the territory. We think because we can name something, we understand it. But understanding is something else entirely. So back to that cafeteria at Los Alamos. When I felt that uncomfortable sensation of not really understanding, I did what I always do. I went back to my room, took out some paper, and I started to work through the problem myself. Not by memorizing what the others had said, but by trying to explain it to myself from scratch, as if I were teaching it to someone who knew nothing about physics. I wrote, "Okay, what is neutron diffusion really about? What's actually happening?" And then I tried to explain it in the simplest possible terms. Not using the fancy equations first, those would come later, but using plain language. I imagined I was explaining it to someone like my father, someone intelligent but without technical training. And here's what happened. I got stuck. I couldn't explain it simply because I didn't understand it well enough. There were gaps in my knowledge that I had been papering over with technical jargon. So I went back to the basic principles. I looked at what I did understand solidly, and I built up from there, piece by piece, always checking. Can I explain this simply? Does this make sense? When I finally could explain it in simple terms, something magical happened. I understood it better than I had before, much better. And more than that, I could see connections to other things I knew. I could see where the equations came from, what they really meant, why they had to be that way and not some other way. This became my method. Whenever I needed to learn something, anything, I would follow this same process. I'd take a blank piece of paper and I'd write at the top, "What is?" And then whatever concept I was trying to understand. Then I'd try to explain it as if I were teaching it to someone bright but completely unfamiliar with the subject. The key is that you can't fool yourself when you do this. You can fool yourself in a lot of ways. You can memorize equations. You can learn to manipulate symbols. You can even get the right answers on tests. But when you try to explain something in plain language, the truth comes out. If you can't explain it simply, you don't really understand it. And let me be clear about what I mean by simply. I don't mean dumbing it down or being imprecise. I mean stripping away the unnecessary complexity, the jargon that we use to hide our lack of understanding. Einstein once said something about this, that you should be able to explain your theory to a barmaid. People laughed at that, but he was right. If you truly understand something, you can explain it in everyday language. The complexity should be in the idea itself, not in the words you use to describe it. I remember when I was trying to understand quantum electrodynamics after the war. This was a field in crisis. The theory made ridiculous predictions, infinities everywhere. People were stuck. I was stuck too, at first. I knew the mathematical machinery, sure, but I didn't really understand what was happening physically. So I started over. I got a notebook and I began to explain it to myself from the beginning. An electron moves from point A to point B. What really happens? I drew pictures, simple pictures, little arrows and lines. I didn't start with the Lagrangian formalism or the canonical approach. I started with, what is the simplest way to think about this? And you know what I discovered? All that fancy machinery that everyone was using, it was obscuring something much simpler underneath. By forcing myself to explain it simply, by using these little pictures I drew, I found a different way to do the calculations, a way that made sense to me physically. Those simple pictures eventually became what people call Feynman diagrams, and they helped solve some of the problems that had everyone confused. But here's what I want you to understand. The diagrams weren't the point. The point was the process of simplification, of explanation, of getting down to what's really happening. The diagrams were just a tool that came out of trying to understand clearly. Now, you might think this approach would be slow, and in one sense it is. It takes longer to really understand something this way than to just memorize formulas or to accept what authorities tell you. But in another sense, it's much faster. Because when you truly understand something, when you can explain it simply and clearly, you never forget it. It becomes part of how you think, and you can use it to understand new things. Because you're not just carrying around a bag of disconnected facts and formulas. You're carrying around principles that you understand deeply. I saw this when I taught at Caltech. Students would come to my office hours, frustrated because they couldn't solve a problem. They'd show me pages of equations they'd written. Look, they'd say, I know the formula, I know what I'm supposed to do, but I can't get the answer. And I'd ask them, what's the problem about? Physically, what's happening? Often, they couldn't tell me. They could write down the equation for conservation of energy, but they couldn't explain what energy conservation actually means. They could manipulate the symbols, but they didn't understand what the symbols represented. So I'd say, forget the equations for a moment. Tell me in words what's happening in this problem, and we'd talk through it. A ball is rolling down a hill. What does that mean? It means it's losing potential energy. Where does that energy go? Into kinetic energy, into movement. How much? Well, it depends on the height of the hill and the mass of the ball. Once they understood it that way, the equations weren't mysterious anymore. The equations were just a precise way of writing down what they already understood. They became tools instead of obstacles. This is what I mean by learning. Not memorization, not symbol manipulation. Understanding. There's another part to this, though. Something equally important. When you explain something to yourself this way, you discover what you don't know. You find the boundaries of your understanding, and that's incredibly valuable. Most people avoid these boundaries. They stay in the safe zone of what they already know, or they pretend the boundaries aren't there. But the boundaries are where all the interesting stuff is. That's where learning happens. That's where the adventure begins. I remember reading about biology later in my life. I was curious about it, but I didn't have the years of background that a professional biologist would have. So I'd read a paper, and I'd come across something like the Krebs cycle, and I'd think, do I really know what that is? So I'd stop and I'd get a piece of paper and I'd try to explain the Krebs cycle to myself. What is it? Why does it happen? What's the purpose? And I'd get stuck on some step. I didn't understand why this molecule becomes that molecule. So I'd look it up. I'd read more carefully. I'd draw it out. And gradually, piece by piece, I'd build up my understanding. The beautiful thing about this method is that it works for anything. Physics, mathematics, biology, history, philosophy, it doesn't matter. The principle is the same. Take an idea and explain it to yourself simply. Find the gaps, fill them in, build from solid ground. And here's something else I discovered. When you learn this way, you often find that the experts don't understand things as well as you thought. You find inconsistencies in their explanations. You find gaps in the standard way of teaching things. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes you find a better way to think about something, a clearer way, because you refuse to accept confusion. I'm not saying this to criticize experts. I'm saying it because it's liberating. You don't have to wait for someone else to explain things perfectly. You don't have to feel inadequate because a textbook confuses you. Sometimes the textbook is just poorly written. Sometimes even the experts are confused. Your job is to understand for yourself in your own way. Of course, you have to be honest with yourself, brutally honest. You can't fake understanding. When you try to explain something and you realize you're just using circular definitions or you're hand-waving over the hard parts, you have to stop and admit, I don't actually get this yet. That's okay. That's good, actually, because now you know what you need to work on. You've turned a vague feeling of confusion into a specific question, and specific questions can be answered. I think one reason many people struggle to learn new things as they get older is not because their minds are less capable, that's mostly nonsense, but because they become less willing to admit confusion. They have identities as knowledgeable people, as experts in their fields, and it's uncomfortable to feel like a beginner again. So they stay on familiar ground. But learning requires that beginner's mind. It requires being willing to say, I don't understand this yet, but I'm going to figure it out. No shame in that, no embarrassment, just curiosity and determination. When I was at Los Alamos, Hans Bethe was there, brilliant physicist, one of the best. And I noticed something about him. Whenever someone explained a new idea to him, he wouldn't just nod and accept it. He'd work through it himself, right there, often asking questions that seemed almost naive. Wait, why does that follow? I don't see how you got from this step to that step. But those naive questions often revealed that the person explaining hadn't really thought it through properly. Bet taught me that real understanding means being able to answer the simple question, the fundamental why question. If you can't answer those, you're building on sand. So here's what I learned, and what I've tried to practice throughout my life. Learning is not about accumulating information. It's not about being able to recite facts or manipulate symbols. Learning is about building a structure of understanding, brick by brick, where each brick is solid and you know why it's where it is. You start with what you understand clearly. You expand from there, always checking. Can I explain this simply? Does this make sense? When you hit something you can't explain simply, that's not a failure, that's a discovery. You found the edge of your understanding. Now you can work on extending it. And you know what happens when you learn this way? You become independent. You don't need to rely on authorities or textbooks or experts to tell you what's true. You can figure things out yourself. You develop judgment. You can tell when someone is explaining something clearly and when they're hiding behind jargon. You can tell when you really understand something and when you're fooling yourself. This independence of mind, that's the real value. Not just the specific things you learn, but the ability to learn anything. The confidence that comes from knowing you can take any subject, no matter how complex or unfamiliar, and gradually make sense of it. There's a freedom in this. You're not trapped by your past education or lack of it. You're not limited by what subjects you studied in school. If you want to understand something, really understand it, you can. It might take time. It might take effort, but it's possible. I've watched people talk themselves out of learning things because they think they're not good at math, or not a science person, or whatever story they've told themselves. But those are just stories. If you're willing to start simple, admit confusion, and work through things step by step, you can understand anything. I think about my father's lesson with the bird. All those fancy names in all those languages, they're easy to collect. You can fill your head with them. You can impress people at parties, but they're empty. Real knowledge is different. Real knowledge is understanding what the bird is doing and why. Real knowledge lets you make predictions, see connections, understand how things work. And the beautiful thing is, anyone can do this. You don't need to be specially gifted. You don't need advanced degrees. You just need curiosity, honesty, and patience. You need to be willing to start simple, to admit confusion, to work through things step by step. I've spent my whole life trying to understand things, and I'm still doing it. There's always more to learn, more to figure out. And every time I sit down with a piece of paper and try to explain something to myself, I'm using the same method I developed as a young man. It never gets old because understanding never gets old. The pleasure of figuring something out, of seeing clearly what was once murky, that never diminishes. So if there's a secret to learning anything fast, it's this. Don't try to go fast, try to go deep. Try to really understand. Explain it simply. Find the gaps, fill them in. Build on solid ground. The speed comes naturally when your foundation is strong. What looks like slow, careful work at the beginning becomes rapid progress later, because you're not constantly backtracking to fix misunderstandings or rememorizing things you never really grasped. And remember, the goal isn't to know more than other people, or to be clever, or to impress anyone. The goal is to see clearly, to understand truly. Everything else, the success, the recognition, the ability to solve difficult problems, that all comes as a byproduct of genuine understanding. Chase understanding, and the rest takes care of itself. That's what I learned anyway. And it served me pretty well.
Most people don't forget what they learned because they have a bad memory. They forget because they never truly learned it in the first place. Learning isn't about collecting information. It's about transforming knowledge into usable understanding. And here's what almost no one realizes. You don't retain what you merely read. You retain what you process. The human mind isn't a storage unit. It's a system of connections. The brain only keeps what turns into reasoning, action, or insight. That's why reading fast, watching videos at double speed, or writing everything down doesn't guarantee learning. The secret lies in what comes after. Between the moment you consume an idea and the moment it becomes part of who you are, there's a gap, and that's where real learning happens. The creator of this method calls it the balance between consumption and mental digestion. Consumption is when you absorb. Digestion is when you transform. One without the other is a waste of time. Most people live stuck in consumption, addicted to collecting content, but never creating an internal structure to retain it. The mind needs pauses. It needs synthesis. It needs application. Whatever you don't translate into action, your brain throws away as irrelevant. So the real question is, are you actually learning or just accumulating? The method you're about to discover, PACER, was designed precisely to solve this problem. to turn reading and studying into lasting retention, mental clarity, and real mastery. PACER is a mental map that transforms any information into permanent knowledge. It divides what you learn into 5 types of content, and each type requires a specific kind of processing. It's like having 5 doors in your mind, and each one opens with a different key. The first letter, P, stands for procedural, practical knowledge, the how to do it. It's learning that requires action, not reading. If you want to learn something skill-based, writing better, playing an instrument, speaking in public, the mind only records it when the body executes it. The command is simple: learn by doing, repeat, practice, make mistakes, adjust. The brain only marks something as important when there's movement and effort. The second letter, A, stands for analogous, knowledge through analogy. Here lies one of the most powerful mental tricks that exist. Every abstract idea needs a concrete image to last. The mind doesn't remember scattered phrases, it remembers vivid comparisons. So whenever you learn something new, create an analogy. Ask yourself, what does this resemble? Or what image represents this in my mind? When you build your own analogies, you force the brain to connect the new with the familiar, and that connection is where learning becomes permanent. The third letter, C, stands for conceptual, the concepts, principles, and relationships between ideas. This is the kind of knowledge that defines the depth of your understanding. Memorizing is easy. Comprehension is rare. To master concepts, reading isn't enough. You have to map them. Build mental networks between ideas. Visualize content as a map, not a list. When the brain understands how the parts connect, it never forgets the whole. The fourth letter, E, stands for evidence, the proof behind an idea. Numbers, examples, experiments, data, facts. This type of information requires organization and review. The most common mistake is underestimating the power of revisiting. The brain forgets by default. It's not designed to store everything. That's why you must teach it what to keep. The process is simple. Store your notes in an accessible way. Use digital notebooks, flashcards, Notion, any tool, and return to them periodically.
Spaced repetition is like oxygen for memory. Reviewing tells the brain, this matters, keep it. The fifth letter is R, for reference, quick access knowledge. These are the details you don't need to keep constantly in your head, but must have within reach. Dates, names, formulas, quotes. The mind works best when you don't overload your internal storage. The secret is to externalize. Build systems to find, not to memorize. Use flashcards, smart notes, or short index cards with spaced review. The goal isn't to know everything. It's to know where to find everything when you need it. And this is where the Packer method comes full circle. It's not a reading technique. It's a system of digestion. It teaches that every type of information must be processed differently because the brain doesn't treat everything the same way. Practical knowledge needs repetition. Conceptual knowledge needs structure. Evidence needs review. And reference knowledge needs systems. That's what separates people who read a lot and forget from those who read little and never forget. Here's the secret. Learning isn't about memorizing words. It's about reconstructing the thinking behind them. Understanding is power. When you truly understand, you don't need to force memory. It becomes a natural consequence of clarity. Most people try to store sentences but forget to store meaning. And meaning is what the brain recognizes as truth. Want to remember forever? Then stop trying to remember. Try to understand. Ask yourself, why does this work? How can I apply this today? What changes if I alter this part? These questions create mental roots. They connect theory to experience. And that bridge is what makes the brain record information deeply.
The mind doesn't learn through mechanical repetition. It learns through engagement. Every time you question, explain, and reconstruct knowledge in your own words, you're literally shaping new neural connections. That's why the biggest mistake is studying as a spectator. You must become a participant in knowledge. The brain is an active system, not a passive one. It needs to build, not just consume. So when you finish studying something, close the book and explain it, even if it's to an empty room. Say out loud what you just learned, as if teaching someone else. And notice, the simpler you can explain it, the deeper your understanding truly is. Real learning happens when you can turn something complex into something clear, fluid, and natural. That's mastery. The mind doesn't want to be full. It wants to be clear. Now think about this. What if learning were an experiment? Not something to memorize, but something to discover. The mind loves to test, to play, to fail, to adjust, to try again. That's how it locks things in. When you turn learning into a mental laboratory, boredom disappears. You begin to engage with the process, to feel genuine curiosity. Don't study just to get it right. Study to understand what happens when you get it wrong. Every mistake is valuable information, a map showing what's still missing. And the more you test, the more your brain understands the pattern. That's how insight is born, that moment when everything suddenly clicks. The brain operates through experimentation, not obedience. So stop trying to learn like a machine and start learning like an explorer. Ask what if, why, how. Write hypotheses, draw possibilities, imagine scenarios. When you do this, you activate the mind's creative power, the same one the great thinkers used to understand the universe. Learning stops being an obligation and becomes living curiosity. Here's the secret. You don't learn by repeating. You learn by recreating, by thinking, combining, altering, mixing ideas until knowledge becomes part of who you are. That's how you never forget, because what you create, the mind recognizes as yours. Everything in the universe is connected, and your mind learns through connection too. True learning happens when you see the bridges between ideas, when you realize that an economic principle can teach you something about human behavior, that a lesson in physics can explain life itself, that a concept in music can reveal how the brain creates harmony between reason and emotion. The mind doesn't work in isolated drawers. It functions like a living web. Every new piece of knowledge must link to something you already understand, and that link is what locks in learning. That's why mind maps work. They turn thought into visible structure, and the more connections you build, the stronger your memory network becomes. It's as if the brain says, I've seen this before, but now I understand it from another angle. The secret isn't memorization, it's association. When reading something new, ask yourself, where does this fit into what I already know? And by answering, you turn information into wisdom. The mind loves patterns, and each time you find one, it builds a neural bridge. That's why some people learn with speed and depth. They don't collect data, they connect worlds. Learning isn't about stacking knowledge, it's about weaving meaning. The more connections you create, the more alive your intelligence becomes. There's a silent strength that separates great thinkers from the rest. The courage to say, I don't know. Because only when you admit you don't know does your mind open to real learning. Pretending to know is like locking a door from the inside. Nothing new can enter. The mind that wants to appear smart is the same one that blocks its own growth. But the mind that embraces emptiness blooms. When you accept that you don't understand something, you awaken the most powerful engine of learning, curiosity. It's what drives the brain to seek connections, test ideas, and rebuild understanding. The curious mind isn't satisfied with ready-made answers. It wants to know why, and it's in that process that learning becomes permanent. Mistakes aren't enemies, they're laboratories. Every doubt is a new neural path waiting to be formed. That's why true learners aren't afraid to look foolish. They're only afraid to stop questioning. The more you allow yourself not to know, the more space you create to discover. The mind that wants to understand everything instantly becomes shallow. The one that embraces uncertainty becomes deep. To know little, but deeply, is worth more than knowing much and understanding nothing. When you take on the role of a lifelong learner, the entire world becomes your classroom, and the joy of discovering becomes the fuel of your mind. Now listen closely. Here's the secret that turns learning into permanence. If you want to remember everything you learn, it's not enough to absorb. You must rebuild.
Knowledge is like a muscle. It grows when you make it move. So every time you learn something new, turn it into simple words, as if you were teaching someone who knows nothing about it. When you do this, you force your mind to reorganize what it understood, and that's when knowledge solidifies. There is no real memorization without explanation. The mind remembers most intensely what it has to recreate. That's why those who teach learn the most. When you explain, your mind forges new connections, transforms data into ideas, and ideas into understanding. And each time you repeat this process, the brain says, "This matters. Keep this with me." Conscious repetition is the cement of learning. But here's the crucial part. Don't repeat mechanically. Repeat with purpose. Relive the emotion of what you learned. Visualize it, connect it, question it, and above all, apply it. Knowledge that isn't used is knowledge that fades. You want to remember? Use what you've learned. Talk about it. Write about it. Test it in real life. The mind understands this. What you use, it keeps. What you ignore, it erases. Forgetting isn't failure. It's filtering. The brain is far too intelligent to store what you don't value. So show it what matters. Practice, share, connect. With each application, knowledge stops being mere information and becomes part of who you are. Now listen carefully, because this is where everything comes together. Learning isn't about accumulation, it's about transformation. True mastery begins when what you know starts changing how you live, when knowledge stops being something you carry and becomes something that guides you. Remember, the mind is fertile ground, but it only blooms when you nurture what you plant. Every idea you understand, every concept you apply, every repetition you do with intention is a seed being watered by awareness. And the result doesn't come by magic, it comes by consistency. The difference between those who forget and those who master is one simple decision: to keep practicing, even when it feels like you already know. Because real learning isn't linear, it's spiral. You return to the same point, but at a deeper level. So the next time you learn something, don't ask, "How can I memorize this?" Ask, "How can I live this?" Because what you live, you never forget. When knowledge becomes action, the brain recognizes it as part of your being. And that's how you remember everything. Not by force, but by identity. You become what you understand, and you understand what you practice. And if you ever doubt yourself, return to the essentials. Simplify, explain, question, apply. That's the cycle. That's the secret to remembering everything you read forever. If this video awakens something inside you, then now is the time to act. Write this in the comments. Today, I reprogram my mind to never forget what I learned. Write it as a command, as a mental affirmation. Because when you write, the brain recognizes it as a decision and begins to work in your favor. Leave your like right now, because that's how you tell YouTube you want more content that expands your awareness. And if you're not yet subscribed, subscribe now. Here, every video is another step in your awakening. Here, you'll learn to master your mind, remember everything you read, and turn knowledge into real power. Your new level of awareness begins now.
All right, so you think you're touching something. You're sitting in a chair, you feel it, seems obvious, seems like the most basic thing in the world, the most fundamental experience you can have. But you're not. You've never touched anything. Not once in your whole life. And I mean that literally, physically, actually. Never touched a single thing. Now, before you tell me I'm crazy, this is just physics. This is what's actually happening. And it's much stranger than whatever you learned in school. Much stranger than the picture you have in your head of what matter is. So, look, atoms. Everything's made of atoms. You know this, fine. They taught you this when you were a kid. But what nobody really emphasizes, what gets lost somehow, is that atoms are almost entirely nothing. I mean really nothing. Not mostly stuff with a little space. Mostly space with almost no stuff. The nucleus. That dense little thing in the center, where almost all the mass lives. It's tiny. Unbelievably tiny compared to the atom itself. If you made it the size of a fly, just a little house fly sitting here on the table, the electrons would be way over there, across a football field, maybe further, maybe out in the parking lot. And between the fly and those electrons, nothing, no stuff, just space, just emptiness, just distance with nothing in it. And yet here you are, feeling solid, The chair feels solid. The floor feels solid. How can that be if you're mostly empty space sitting on something else that's mostly empty space? Two clouds of nothing pressing against each other, and somehow you don't fall through? This is the question. This is where it gets interesting. See, the space isn't really empty, and that's the mistake everyone makes when they first hear about atoms. They think empty means nothing's happening, nothing's there, it's just void waiting to be filled with something. But something is happening. Something is very much there. Field, electric fields everywhere, extending through that space, filling it with invisible influence. Every electron, every proton, they don't just sit there being little balls, little points of stuff floating in nothing. They reach out. They create this influence around them that extends through space in all directions. And that influence is the field, the electric field, the electromagnetic field. And look, the field is real. People get confused about this. They think it's just a mathematical trick, a convenient way to calculate things, a shortcut we invented because the real explanation is too complicated. No, no, no. The field is there. It exists in space. It carries energy. It carries momentum. It does things. You can't see it, but you can see what it does. And what it does is hold the world together. So you've got atoms, and around each atom there's this electric field spreading out in all directions, getting weaker with distance, but never quite disappearing, extending in principle all the way across the universe. When two atoms get close, their fields meet first. The fields start interacting before the atoms themselves get anywhere near each other. And here's the thing about electric fields. The electrons in your hand, the ones on the outer edge of your atoms, they're negative. The electrons in the table, same thing, negative, same charge. And what do same charges do? They repel. They push each other away. They say, no, you can't come here. This space is mine. Go somewhere else. So, when you press your hand on a table, what you feel, that pressure, that resistance, that sensation of solidity, it's not atoms hitting atoms. It's not little balls bouncing off other little balls. It's fields pushing against fields, electromagnetic repulsion. The electrons get close enough that their fields overlap, and the fields say, no, absolutely not. You shall not pass. And you feel that as touch. You feel electromagnetic repulsion, and your brain interprets it as contact, as solid matter, as the experience of touching something. But the atoms never meet. There's always a gap. Always, always, always a gap. Your electrons and the table's electrons never make contact, never actually reach each other. They're always separated by this buffer of electromagnetic force, pushing them apart. You're floating right now. Did you know that? You're floating a tiny, tiny distance above your chair, suspended by electric forces, hovering on a cushion of electromagnetic repulsion. You've been floating your whole life. You never knew it. Every time you thought you touched something, you were hovering just above it, pushed away by invisible forces. Now you might say, fine, but what's the difference? It feels like touching. It works like touching. Who cares about the details of what's happening down there at that scale? And okay, from a practical standpoint, from the standpoint of getting through your day and sitting in chairs and picking up coffee cups, it doesn't matter. You can ignore all this and live your life just fine. But if you want to understand nature, if you want to know what's actually going on, if you want to see reality clearly instead of through the fog of everyday assumptions, this is it. This is the beginning. The solid world isn't solid. Touch isn't touch. And the space between atoms, that vast emptiness that makes up most of what you are, it's not empty at all. It's full of fields. And those fields are full of something even stranger. So the space between atoms is full of fields. Electric fields, electromagnetic field, reaching out from every charged particle, filling what looks like emptiness with invisible influence. But that's not the end of the story. That's not even the strange part yet. What happens when you take everything away? Not just the atoms in air, not just the dust and the molecule, everything. You pump all the matter out of a region of space. You create the most perfect vacuum you possibly can. And then you ask, what's left? Nothing, right? Has to be nothing. You took everything out. That's what vacuum means. That's what empty means. There's nothing there anymore. Wrong. Can't be nothing. Nature doesn't allow it. The universe refuses to be truly empty anywhere, ever, under any circumstances. See, quantum mechanics has this thing called the uncertainty principle, and most people have heard of it, but they don't understand what it really means. They think it's about measurement, about how looking at something changes it. And okay, fine, that's part of it, but there's something deeper. The uncertainty principle says you cannot know certain pairs of properties exactly at the same time. Position and momentum, you can't pin down both, but also energy and time. You cannot have a region of space with exactly, precisely zero energy for any extended period of time. It's not permitted. The equations forbid it. The mathematics of quantum mechanics says no, you don't get to have perfect emptiness. That's too exact, too precise. Nature doesn't work that way. So what happens instead? The vacuum fluctuates. Even with nothing in it, it's doing something. It's restless. It can't sit still. Little pairs of particles pop into existence out of nowhere. A particle and its antiparticle, an electron and a positron, a quark and an antiquark. They appear spontaneously in empty space. They exist for an incredibly short time, so short you can barely define it, and then they find each other and annihilate and vanish, gone, like they were never there. Virtual particles, they're called. Virtual because you can't catch them directly. You can't put them in a bottle and look at them. They exist for too short a time to observe in the normal way. But they're there. They have effects, real, measurable effects. Now people ask, okay, fine, but where does the energy come from? You can't just make particles out of nothing. That violates conservation of energy. You can't get something from nothing. And it's a good question. It really is a good question. But here's how it works. The uncertainty principle says you can borrow energy from nowhere as long as you pay it back fast enough. The shorter the time, the more energy you can borrow. It's like taking money from a bank and returning it before anyone checks the books. As long as the accounting balances out in the end, as long as the energy gets paid back before the universe notices the debt, it's allowed. Virtual particles pop into existence on borrowed energy, and they pay it back by annihilating. The debt gets settled. Conservation of energy is satisfied, on average, over time. But at any given instant, there's this frenzy of borrowing and repaying happening everywhere in space. Nature runs on credit at the smallest scales. Temporary violations everywhere, constantly, as long as everything balances out in the end. And this isn't some theoretical speculation, some mathematical game physicists play because they're bored. We can measure this. There's an experiment called the Casimir effect, and it proves the vacuum is not empty. You take two metal plates, very thin, very flat, and you put them close together in a vacuum, almost touching, but not quite, just a tiny gap between them, smaller than the width of a hair, as small as you can manage. And they attract, they pull toward each other. Not because of gravity. Gravity's way too weak to notice at that scale. Not because of static electricity. Nothing's charged here. The plates are neutral. The space is empty. There's no reason for them to move. But they do. They pull together. And the reason is virtual particles. See, virtual particles have wavelengths, like waves in the ocean have wavelengths, different sizes of oscillation. And when the plates are very close together, some wavelengths don't fit in between. It's like trying to fit a long wave into a short space. It doesn't work. Those particular virtual particles can't exist between the plates. So, there's fewer virtual particles popping up between the plates than outside them. More activity outside, less activity inside. And that imbalance creates pressure. More pressure pushing the plates together from outside than pushing them apart from inside. The plates move toward each other, squeezed by empty space, pushed by nothing. This has been measured, precisely measured. The force is exactly what quantum mechanics predicts. The vacuum is not empty. The vacuum pushes things around. So, think about the space between atoms now. Got it? The space inside you. It's not just fields sitting there quietly humming along. It's churning. It's frothing. Virtual particles are appearing and disappearing constantly, right now, inside your body. In every bit of empty space within every atom that makes up your hand, your heart, your brain. The emptiness inside matter is not empty. It's the busiest place in the universe. Creation and destruction happening billions of times per second in every cubic centimeter of space. And this is everywhere, not just in atoms, not just in matter. The space between here and the moon, the space between stars, between galaxies, the vast stretches of what looks like nothing. Same thing. Virtual particles appearing and vanishing. The vacuum churning and fluctuating and refusing to be still. There is no quiet place in the universe. There is no place where truly nothing happened. You cannot find nothing. Nowhere in the entire cosmos is there actual emptiness. Physics won't allow it. So, the vacuum seethes with activity. Virtual particles everywhere, all the time, popping in and out of existence faster than you can imagine. The emptiness between atoms, between stars, between galaxies, it's all the same, all churning, all restless. And this changes everything about how you should think about matter, about space, about yourself. See, people talk about the vacuum like it's the absence of everything, the default state, the boring part, what you get when you take away all the interesting stuff. Clear the stage, and what's left is nothing, right? Empty space waiting for something to happen in it. But that's completely backward. The vacuum isn't absence, it's foundation. It's not what you get when you remove everything. It's what everything comes out of. The vacuum is the ground state of reality, the lowest energy configuration of the fields that fill all of space. And that lowest energy still can't be zero. Particles aren't stuff that exists in empty space. Particles are excitations in fields, and those fields exist everywhere, including in the vacuum. A particle is just the field doing something more than usual, vibrating a little harder, carrying a little more energy than the quiet background hum. Matter isn't stuff sitting in empty space. Matter is space doing something different, a different configuration of the same fields that make up the vacuum. You and the empty space next to you are made of the same thing, the same fields, the same quantum substrate. You're just arranged differently. You're a pattern, a ripple, a fluctuation that got complicated and started walking around and asking questions about itself. The vacuum could have been you if things had gone differently. And someday, when those patterns disperse, when the arrangement that calls itself you stops being arranged that way, you'll be vacuum again. The fields you're made of will still be there, just in their ground state, just doing the minimum, waiting to become something else. Now let's go back to you sitting in your chair and put it all together. What's actually happening? You're a collection of atoms, right? That's the first level. Those atoms are held together by electromagnetic forces, by fields, pulling electrons toward nuclei and pushing electrons away from each other. Chemical bonds, molecular structures, all of that is electromagnetic fields doing their thing. But those atoms are mostly empty space. The nuclei are tiny, the electrons are far away, and in between, there's this vast emptiness filled with electric fields. And you're not falling through the chair because your electric fields are pushing against the chair's electric fields. Electromagnetic repulsion. That's what solid feels like. That's what touch is. But inside all that empty space, inside every atom, inside every gap between every particle, the vacuum fluctuates. Virtual particles flash in and out of existence. The quantum foam bubbles away constantly, everywhere, all the time. So, you're not just atoms. You're atoms that are mostly fields that are full of virtual activity. Patterns on top of patterns on top of a churning quantum sea that can never be still. And there's no bottom to it. That's what gets me. You zoom in looking for solid reality, looking for the thing that everything else is made of, the foundation, the bedrock, and it keeps dissolving. Atoms aren't solid, they're mostly empty. The empty isn't empty, it's full of fields. The fields aren't static, they're fluctuating with virtual particles. And the particles themselves, when you look closely, they're just excitations in other fields. It's fields all the way down. There's no point where you hit something solid and say, here, this is what it's really made of. This is the ultimate stuff. It's like looking for the bottom of a lake and finding out the lake goes down forever. At some point, you have to accept there is no bottom. There's just water all the way down, getting darker and stranger the deeper you go, but never hitting rock. Reality is like that. No foundation, no stuff, just activity, patterns, relationships, things interacting with other things, and those things themselves being nothing but interactions. The universe isn't made of stuff. It's made of happening, events, processes. The feeling of solidity, the experience of touching something, of being something. It's all patterns in fields that extend across all of space. And those fields connect everything. The electromagnetic field in your hand is the same field as the electromagnetic field in that distant star. Same field, not a copy, not a similar field, the same one. It extends continuously through all of space, and particles are just places where that field is doing something interesting. You're not separate, universe. You can't be. You're a localized pattern in fields that extend everywhere. You're connected to everything by the very medium that makes you up. So what's between the atom? What's in that vast space that makes up most of what you are? Fields. Real physical fields that carry energy and exert forces. Virtual particles bubbling up from the quantum vacuum, appearing and disappearing, borrowing energy and paying it back. Activity and fluctuation and potential. Not nothing, never nothing. The universe doesn't do nothing. It can't. Emptiness is forbidden. Perfect stillness is impossible. The vacuum itself is alive with creation and destruction at scales too small and too fast to see. And when you finally understand that, when it really sinks in, the world stops looking like a collection of solid objects sitting in empty space. It starts looking like what it actually is. A web of interactions, fields influencing fields, patterns emerging and dissolving, with no hard edges anywhere, no true emptiness anywhere, no foundation except the churning quantum vacuum that can never sit still. The space inside you and the space between galaxies, it's the same space, made of the same stuff, doing the same things. The only difference is the pattern. The only difference is the arrangement. That's what you are. That's what everything is.